Thank you. Thank you for coming out on this lovely afternoon. So historians who study migration know that extreme weather events like earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and hurricanes, and slower onset disasters like drought, soil erosion, and desertification have displaced people for millennia. It's part of the human story. Such events and conditions have served as tipping points that set societal change into motion, or they accelerate changes that are already underway. These events disrupt livelihoods, they spark sectarian conflict, they destabilize governments, they force people to migrate internally within their own countries and across imperial, continental, and national borders. There are many examples of this phenomena in the study of history. Let me give you just one example from our hemisphere. In 1972, an earthquake measuring 6.3 on the Richter scale devastated Nicaragua's capital city of Managua, killing 10,000 people and leaving 250,000 people homeless. One of the indirect casualties of this earthquake was the beloved Puerto Rican baseball player Roberto Clemente of the Pittsburgh Pirates, who died when his chartered plane delivering humanitarian aid crashed into the ocean and was never recovered. This earthquake had dramatic political consequences for Nicaragua and for the entire region. When opposition newspapers in Nicaragua reported that the dictator Anastasio Somoza Jr. and his cronies had stolen much of the humanitarian aid, popular anger swelled the ranks of the Sandinista movement that eventually drove Somoza from power, ending a family dynasty that had ruled Nicaragua for almost 40 years. The Sandinista revolution, in turn, sparked a counter-revolution. The Reagan administration subsequently launched a war to unseat the Sandinistas, the so-called Contra-War, which had devastating consequences for Central America. This war also contributed to a large outmigration of Nicaraguans to neighboring Costa Rica, where today they constitute 10% of the population. But it also produced a migration as far north as Miami, Los Angeles, and Toronto. The study of history offers us many, many examples of how environmental disasters have cascading effects, have cascading consequences. They disrupt lives and livelihoods, and they have political, economic, and demographic consequences for societies. It's part of the human story. But we are now living in an era of accelerating climate change. At no other time in human history have we had 8 billion people living on the planet, all contributing in some way to the behaviors that are accelerating changes that in the deep past occurred over thousands of years rather than decades. The sustained rise in global temperatures has led to the unusually rapid melting of polar ice sheets, permafrost, and glaciers that is resulting in sea level rise, erosion, and the salination of soil and water. The higher temperatures are also shifting weather patterns, leading to more intense, rapid impact events like hurricanes and typhoons in some parts of the world, and drought and desertification and wildfires in other parts of the world. These disruptions are causing crop failures and freshwater shortages, infrastructure breakdowns and energy blackouts, infectious disease outbreaks, and the loss of arable land, natural habitat, and wildlife. 60% of all mammals have disappeared over the course of my lifetime alone. As environmental historian John R. McNeil wrote back in 2007, while there are analogs in Earth's history for the climate change now underway, there are none in human history. We have entered uncharted terrain. Now, much of the discussion on climate change has focused on sustainability and on resilience, that is, helping societies adapt to the realities of climate change. And those discussions are essential. They're absolutely necessary. But how will we respond to those who cannot adapt and are forced to cross international borders in search of safety? Those who survive environmental disasters are often permanently deprived of home, livelihood, schooling, food, clean water, and sanitation. In order to survive, they must migrate internally within their own countries or across national borders. Migration becomes a form of adaptation. Today, 80% of climate-driven migration is internal within their own countries, but that will change with each passing decade. And that's the subject of my book. How will we respond to climate-driven migration? And I look at several case studies of the recent past of both cross-border and internal migration to see what lessons we might learn for guiding climate and immigration policies moving forward. But these case studies are more than just examples of environmental disasters. Natural disasters are also policy disasters. They make evident inequality, violence, indebtedness, corruption, and failed development policies. They make evident the legacies of war and colonialism. Natural disasters may be inevitable in a world of accelerated climate change, but human displacement reveals the failures of nation states. Now, those displaced by natural disasters and climate change are often called climate refugees, but most are not refugees under legal definitions of the term. The term refugee has a very precise meaning in domestic and international law. Here in the United States, refugees are individuals unable to return to their country of origin or of habitual residence on account of a well-founded fear of persecution based on race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. Nowhere in this definition do you see any mention of climate, the disasters, or the environment. We may call someone a refugee, but that doesn't mean that the law views them as such. The refugee track in our immigration bureaucracy cannot accommodate those permanently displaced from their homes because of environmental disasters or climate change unless they can prove that they have subsequently experienced persecution on the basis of these categories. Now, when we look at the arc of immigration history, we see that the United States has, on occasion, accommodated populations that have been displaced because of environmental disasters. But at this time, the United States does not have a well-formulated short or long-term response to climate-driven migration, and it needs to, quickly. Our immigration bureaucracy today prioritizes three groups of people: those who have particular skills that are necessary to the US economy, those who seek reunification with their families, and those who are seeking political asylum. These distinct tracks for admission fail to recognize that more often than not, migration is multi-causal, produced by a wide and complex range of intersecting drivers that oftentimes make it impossible to pinpoint a sole cause for migration. The environmental drivers for migration are often obscured in the reports of the US immigration bureaucracy. It's only when scholars and journalists have interviewed immigrants that they have been able to identify these environmental drivers. It's in the stories that migrants tell that their experiences with the environmental drivers become evident. Here's one example. Environmental disasters displace Hondurans every single year. Central America is hit hard by hurricanes on two coasts, the Pacific, the Caribbean Sea. It's also, Central America is part of the Central American dry corridor, which makes it susceptible to drought. It's also, there's a string of 900 volcanoes that runs through the isthmus, some of which erupt on a regular basis. Earthquakes are endemic to this region as well. It's an area of the world that some journalists have called ground zero for climate change in the Americas. So it's not unusual for farmers in Honduras and many other Central American countries to be displaced from their homes for environmental reasons. When these farmers migrate to the cities in search of work, cities like San Pedro Sula or Tegucigalpa in search of work, they may not find the jobs that they seek, or they may encounter the political and criminal violence that then convinces them to undertake an overland journey to Mexico, the United States, or Canada. But by the time they reach the US-Mexico border, our politicians and news media have portrayed them as economic migrants who are storming the gates in migrant caravans. Yes, these immigrants are economically driven, but lost in this conversation are the environmental and political drivers that also displace them. Their migration is multi-causal, but that gets lost in the conversation. They won't call themselves climate refugees. More often than not, the word is not in their vocabulary. But the stories that they tell speak to the difficulties of farming on an ever-changing landscape in a country that often faces back-to-back disasters, giving them little room to recover and rebuild. People like this Honduran farmer are not prioritized for admission to the United States. At present, temporary protected status is the principal track in our immigration bureaucracy through which the United States accommodates those who are affected by natural disaster. The 1990 Immigration Act created the statutory provision known as TPS, Temporary Protected Status. Those unable to return to their homes because of armed conflict or because of environmental disaster or some extraordinary and temporary condition could, under some conditions, remain and work in the United States until it was safe to return. There is one catch, however. In order to qualify for TPS, you already have to be living in the United States, or you have to be physically present in the United States. One cannot migrate to the US with the hopes of securing TPS. It doesn't work that way. Who qualifies then? Well, it's tourists and students and business executives and those on temporary worker visas. They are the principal beneficiaries of temporary protected status, but undocumented workers also potentially qualify. Individuals with TPS do not qualify for a state or federal welfare assistance, but they do receive the right to work. And while they live and work in the United States, they are investing in our economy through their labor, but also through the payment of taxes, federal taxes, Social Security, state, and sales tax. The Central American countries of Nicaragua, Honduras, and El Salvador, and the Caribbean countries of Montserrat and Haiti are among the 22 countries whose nationals have qualified for TPS since 1990. All of the Central American and Caribbean countries qualified because of environmental disasters in their homeland. TPS is based on the understanding that countries in crisis need time to recover. If nationals return home abruptly in very large numbers, that return migration can have a destabilizing effect that inhibits a country's recovery. TPS is also a recognition that nationals living abroad can help a country's recovery by sending home remittances. And they do, billions of dollars every single year. El Salvador alone receives over $5 billion a year in remittances from their nationals living around the world. But in a world of accelerating climate change, TPS cannot be our only response to those permanently displaced from their homes, and I explain why in this book. But let me give you two examples of environmental disasters from the recent past that demonstrate the limitations of temporary protected status for dealing with climate-driven migration. Example number one. On August 21st, 1995, a long dormant volcano in Soufriere Hills on the Caribbean island of Montserrat erupted. It was the first major volcanic eruption in over 400 years. The eruption forced the relocation of half of the country's population to the northern part of the island. The evacuees were eventually allowed to return home after a few weeks, and the Montserratians thought that was the end of the problem, the end of the crisis. But over the next 2 decades, volcanic activity, including major eruptions in 1997, 2000, 2003, and 2004, caused widespread devastation. With a total land area mass of only 40 square miles, the phreatic surges and flows damaged or destroyed 3/4 of the island's infrastructure, damaging water supplies, electrical lines, and telephone service, as well as homes, businesses, medical clinics, schools, government buildings, the airport, and even the state archives that documented centuries of Montserrat's history and culture. The 1997 eruptions left the capital city of Plymouth uninhabitable and required the relocation of the seat of government, first to the town of Salem, and then eventually to the town of Brady's. This is a photo of Plymouth as it appears today. It has been nicknamed the Pompeii of the tropics and is now used by the Montserratian government as a tourist attraction to draw in much needed revenue. As you can imagine, the environmental crisis brought to a halt life as Montserratians knew it. It brought to a halt administrative, commercial, industrial, and seaport activity. It devastated agricultural, fishery, and tourism sectors of the economy. It created all sorts of health problems for the population, as thousands were crammed into emergency shelters, and respiratory illnesses became common, along with the psychological stress of coping with the seemingly interminable disaster. By 1998, 3/4 of all Montserratians had left the island for the United Kingdom, the United States, and Canada, and the Caribbean countries of Antigua Barbuda, St. Kitts Nevis, and Guadeloupe. Most of them would never again return home. As I mentioned earlier, the volcano had not erupted in over 400 years. What makes this crisis all the more paradoxical is that a risk assessment conducted a few years before the first eruption had determined that the volcano posed only a 1% risk to the population every century. Although Montserratians were residents of a dependent territory in the powerful British Commonwealth, the 10,000 residents of Montserrat struggled to receive the humanitarian relief and the economic assistance they needed in order to survive and to rebuild. And chapter 1 of my books goes into great detail about the struggles with the UK to try to get the assistance that they needed to survive and rebuild. This crisis made evident the lack of sustainable development in Montserrat, but it also illustrated Montserrat's political vulnerability, ruled by dual governments that oftentimes worked at cross purposes. The British called this humanitarian crisis the worst humanitarian crisis since the Falklands War. And the crisis eventually led to a restructuring of Montserrat's political status within the British Commonwealth. And this allowed many Montserratians to eventually establish permanent residency in the United Kingdom. Prior to this renegotiation, they didn't qualify for permanent residency, but after this renegotiation, they did. Those who fled to the United States after the first volcanic eruption were later designated as the first group of foreign nationals to qualify for temporary protected status for reasons of environmental disaster. They received TPS in 1997. Their numbers were not large by any stretch of the imagination. The Department of Justice estimated that perhaps as many as 1,000 people might be eligible for TPS, but the number of people who actually came forward to avail themselves of this status was actually much, much smaller. TPS was extended for the Montserratians every 18 months from 1997 until 2004, when the Department of Homeland Security conceded that the volcanic eruptions might never end. And since the volcanic eruptions could no longer be considered temporary in nature, the Bush administration decided that TPS was no longer an appropriate response. By this date, there were only 292 Montserratians who held TPS in the United States. But rather than offer them a pathway to citizenship, Homeland Security announced that Montserratians would have 1 year to get their affairs in order before they were ordered removed from the United States. Now, the decision to terminate TPS for the Montserratians elicited considerable outrage, as you might imagine. Editorials and op-eds across the United States criticized the decision. An editorial in the Washington Post, for example, asked, "Why exactly DHS has taken this absurd and cruel step is a bit of a mystery. The Montserratians are hardly a drain on American society. They are doctors and nurses, and they work in the service economy. It's wrong for this country, having promised people haven, to renege on that promise because the problem that drove them here turns out to be more severe and more tractable than policymakers imagined." In the months leading to the 2005 deadline, political allies in Congress looked for other solutions. A number of politicians, among them Charles Schumer and Ted Kennedy, introduced bills to grant the Montserratians permanent residency and a pathway to citizenship. But in the post-9/11 climate, virtually all immigration bills were difficult to pass. The TPS date, the termination date arrived, and the Justice Department ordered the Montserratians to leave the United States. Now contrast the experience of the Montserratians with the Nicaraguans and Hondurans of Hurricane Mitch. Hurricane Mitch was the 13th hurricane of the 1998 hurricane season. By the afternoon of October 26, Mitch had reached the northern coast of Nicaragua and Honduras as a Category 5 hurricane with a surface wind velocity of 180 miles per hour, causing torrential rain, flooding, and mudslides. The disaster made evident the poor city planning and inferior building construction across Central America. It revealed the unsustainable agricultural, forestry, and ranching practices that created deforestation and unstable slopes that now resulted in mudslides that buried entire towns. But the hurricane also made evident the deep-rooted inequality, since it was the rural and urban poor, especially women, children, the elderly, and indigenous and Afro-descendant populations, who were disproportionately killed or uprooted from their homes, lands, and livelihoods. Hurricane Mitch was both a natural disaster and a policy-driven disaster, and the poor endured the most significant consequences. As one Honduran scholar noted, the rains fell on all of Honduras, but not everyone got drenched. Across Central America, the catalog of destruction was heartbreaking, but Nicaragua and Honduras were especially hard hit. In Nicaragua, 450,000 people were left homeless, and in Honduras, 600,000 people were left homeless. The storm destroyed tens of thousands of private and public buildings, including homes, schools, and medical clinics. Although emergency humanitarian aid arrived from all over the world, aid workers found it difficult to reach the needy victims because the storm destroyed or damaged the bridges and the roads or made them impassable. To make matters even more dire, the flooding and the mudslides unearthed and changed the location of the landmines that had been left over from the decades-long Sandinista-Contra War, killing many of those who were trying to clean up the hurricane's debris. Farmers suffered heavy losses in export crops like bananas, sugarcane, rice, grain, and vegetable crops. The following year's harvest was also in question since planting occurred in November and December, and yet the fields and the equipment were underwater for months afterwards. The loss of livestock meant that dairy, egg, and meat production also declined in the following years. The shrimping and fishing industry were hard hit when shrimp farms were destroyed and fishermen lost their boats for trawling. But broken sewer lines and septic tanks also polluted area waters, making whitefish, another staple product, unsafe to eat and unsafe for export. Only the coffee crop seemed comparatively unscathed, but the condition of roads, bridges, and ports made the delivery of the coffee crop to market virtually impossible. Despite the Central American isthmus' susceptibility to hurricanes, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, drought, and other natural disasters, regional governments were not prepared to deal with the crisis, in part because of their poverty, but also because of their indebtedness. Much of their national income went to just service the debt, preventing the large-scale infrastructure projects that are necessary to help populations adapt to environmental change. But these were also post-conflict societies still dealing with the fallout of decades-long war. The Clinton administration was aware of this. They monitored the situation in Central America carefully, and they provided Congress and the news media with regular updates on recovery efforts. Knowing that Congress was weary of U.S. interventions in Central America, administration officials assured them that any expenditures on humanitarian relief and reconstruction in Central America was money that served our national interests. And when moral appeals failed, the Clinton administration used the threat of a new Central American migration to convince reluctant legislators to open government coffers. These compelling rationales to justify humanitarian assistance sidestep the fact that the United States had a particular obligation to Central America. Central America's obstacles to recovery were due in part to the wars of the previous decades, which had exacerbated inequality and corruption and had weakened political institutions and civil society. The United States had been an actor in these wars, which some called proxy wars. The United States had used Honduras as a base for launching a covert war against the Sandinista government in Nicaragua in the 1980s that had forced both countries to redirect their economic resources towards their country's military and national security. So it's this history of US intervention in the region that shaped humanitarian and immigration policy responses to Hurricane Mitch. Over the next 5 years, the United States invested billions of dollars in Central America's recovery from Hurricane Mitch through humanitarian relief, but also through the deferral of debt repayments. On the immigration front, the United States temporarily suspended the deportation of tens of thousands of undocumented Nicaraguans and Hondurans, knowing that their sudden arrival back home would only put more economic pressure on these governments that were trying to rebuild their homes and provide jobs. And the administration also offered TPS to tens of thousands of Nicaraguans and Hondurans who were already in the United States as students, tourists, merchants, and as undocumented workers. Migration in the wake of the Central American Peace Accords in 1992 and 1996, migration from Central America had begun to level off and even decline. But in the years after Hurricane Mitch, it picked up again. Of the two countries that were hardest hit by Mitch, Nicaragua and Honduras, Honduras produced the largest migration to the United States. Most Nicaraguan immigrants seem to have migrated to Costa Rica, where they already comprise 10% of the population. But 81% of those who left Honduras after Hurricane Mitch left for the United States and for Canada. Many Hondurans never made it past the US-Mexico border. By 2002, more Hondurans were detained and deported than any other Central American group. But many did manage to find a way into the United States, both with and without authorization. And by 2005, the city of New Orleans became home to the largest Honduran population in the United States. In some parts of Honduras, migration became an important part of day-to-day life in the wake of Hurricane Mitch. As anthropologist Daniel Reichman, a Cornell PhD from the anthropology department here, he found in his study of coffee farmers that migration to the United States was transformed from a relatively unusual practice of last resort to a routine part of social life used to manage the cyclical nature of the coffee trade. Migrant remittances to Honduras also increased. In fact, 2 years after Hurricane Mitch, Hondurans outside the country were sending $450 million back home. By 2019, they were sending $5.4 billion in remittances back home. Millions more were sent home in appliances, computers, cell phones, and other consumer goods. As scholar Manuel Torres Calderon noted, migrants had become Honduras's most important export, more valuable than the country's banana and coffee crop. Now, back in 1998, the Clinton administration recognized that climate change played a role in Central America's destabilization. In her syndicated column, First Lady Hillary Clinton warned, "Climate experts predict that ferocious hurricanes like Mitch are typical of the disasters that we can expect in the future as a result of global climate change. This was 1998. 2 decades later, in 2020, we had another record-breaking hurricane season, the most active Atlantic hurricane season on record to date, so active that the World Meteorological Organization had to draw on the Greek alphabet after it exhausted its list of 2020 names. That year, 20 years after Hurricane Mitch, Hurricanes Eta and Iota once again caused severe flooding and landslides in Central America, affecting 11 million people who were already suffering from other disasters, including the coronavirus pandemic. Like Hurricane Mitch 22 years earlier, the 2 hurricanes which drove through Central America as Category 4 storms devastated both rural and major metropolitan areas and washed away homes, schools, businesses, roads and bridges, flooded agricultural fields, and damaged infrastructure. Once again, citizens crammed into temporary shelters, only now the cramped conditions made the spreading of the COVID-19 virus an additional threat. Though aid workers arrived from all over the world to assist with relief and recovery efforts, many believed that it would take a decade or more for Central America to recover from Eta and Iota. As one scholar noted, in a short period of time, the hurricanes had become 2 more in a long list of tragedies. In a region continuing to suffer from poverty, death, and other natural and human disasters, it's not surprising that Central Americans once again resorted to the age-old coping strategy of migration. But this time, the Central American migrants encountered a much more hostile Trump and Biden administrations. But to come back to the topic of TPS, the 3,200 Nicaraguans who qualified for TPS after Hurricane Mitch, and the 60,000 Hondurans who qualified for TPS after Hurricane Mitch, have lived in legal limbo for a quarter century. TPS has been repeatedly extended for them every 18 months for over 2 decades. This has created a population that holds a liminal status in the United States. They are both part of the nation and yet outside of it. They have little chance of permanent residency unless they find some other means to secure it, or unless Congress creates a pathway for citizenship for them. They are both part of the nation and yet outside of it. Since TPS was created in 1990, TPS recipients from other nations have found their status suspended, and they've eventually been ordered to return home, like the 292 Montserratians who were ordered to leave in 2005. But the TPS status of these three Central American countries, Nicaragua and Honduras of Hurricane Mitch, and the Salvadorans who qualified for temporary protected status in 2001 as a result of an earthquake, for them, TPS has repeatedly been extended in large part because of the United States' enduring interest in the political stability of this region. TPS has served foreign policy interests. So I hope you can see by now that TPS cannot be the only way that we respond to those who have been affected by environmental disaster. It won't work in an era of accelerated climate change. For decades now, scholars and humanitarian advocates in the United States have called for a reevaluation of our immigration and refugee policies. Some have called for a revision of refugee law to draft a more expansive definition of refugee that would allow people like the climate refugees to be considered for accommodation in the United States. Others have said, no, leave the refugee law alone. Let's create a separate and complementary track for admission for those who have been permanently displaced from their homes because of climate change. Either response would be a recognition that the United States, like other developed nations, has a responsibility to assist those who are currently on the front lines of a global crisis that they did not create. In 2019, Senator Edward Markey and Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez introduced the first bills of the 21st century to accommodate climate-displaced persons. The bills failed to pass, and they were reintroduced in this current legislative session. If these bills ever pass, and that's a very big if, they will authorize the president to create a quota for climate-displaced persons every fiscal year at the same time that the president determines the refugee quota. In taking these actions, Markey and Velasquez have followed New Zealand's lead. New Zealand was the first country, and is currently the only country, I believe, to have created an immigration visa for those displaced by accelerating climate change. But while New Zealand's visa is capped at 100, Markey and Velasquez envision a minimum of 50,000 visas per year. The climate forecasts for the next 50 years are daunting, making climate change one of the most important challenges in world affairs today. Every nation, including the United States, is and will continue to be affected by accelerating climate change and will have its own climate migrants within its borders. Already do. The urgency of addressing these issues cannot be ignored. As UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said in a recent speech, the scientific data on climate change has issued us a code red for humanity. There are currently 90 million people around the world today who have been forced to flee their homes, more than a quarter of them for environmental reasons. But the projections for the next 3 decades are staggering, ranging from 100 million climate refugees to over 1 billion climate refugees. But the truth is that we can't project with any certainty how many people will be displaced because so much depends on how we respond moving forward. As one World Bank study noted, if the international community works together to mitigate the effects of climate change, migration can be reduced as much as 80% by 2050. Policy responses need to proceed on multiple tracks at once. We need to continue to offer humanitarian assistance to those who are affected by environmental disaster. We have to help communities adapt to the realities of climate change in their housing, infrastructure, and agriculture so they can exercise the basic human right to stay home. We have to address the individual and collective behaviors that are accelerating climate change in the first place. We have to change the policies that have impoverished and indebted nations around the globe, leaving them on the front lines of a problem that they have not created. And collectively, we need to accommodate those who have been or will be permanently displaced from their homes through managed resettlement programs. Now, national security agendas tend to categorize climate-driven migration as a disaster in and of itself. A disaster that has to be controlled, usually by blocking the movement of people. It shouldn't be surprising that the Pentagon and our intelligence communities have been studying climate change for quite some time because climate change is what is considered a threat multiplier, to use the language of the security community. It's a threat multiplier that requires the relocation of bases like Hampton Roads that you see here on the screen. It requires the involvement of the military in more humanitarian missions like the one in Mozambique. It requires the participation of the military in conflict resolutions, in the protection of natural resources. But perhaps instead of framing it in the language of security, perhaps we should reframe the discussion to recognize the opportunities for cooperation, for solidarity, and for community building. Right now, the populations of developing countries are on the front lines of climate change's impacts. But even citizens in wealthy nations like the United States are not insulated from the problems that our government and industry leaders have created, or the problems that our own consumerism have created. Natural disasters may be impossible to prevent, but the effects of climate change can be mitigated. And the best response to climate-driven migration is not ad hoc immigration policies that are only bandages on a much larger problem. Nations must address the reason why people migrate in the first place. And that requires difficult conversations about the economic policies that have accelerated climate change, indebted nations, driven more people into poverty, and made it impossible for people to exercise the basic human right to stay home. Only then will we be able to help populations adapt to the challenges of today and tomorrow. And I thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much for such an important talk. I wanted to open up for questions. Does anyone have any questions? I guess I can get us started.
Sure.
Your first book focused on post-Cold War asylum policies, particularly when you were talking about Montserrat and some of the other policies. How would you maybe characterize post-9/11 policies and how they have inevitably affected climate change and asylum seekers?
Well, one of the reasons I started working on this new book, I'm going to answer your question indirectly. I think one of the reasons I worked on this book, so yes, I wrote this book called The Refugee Challenge in Post-Cold War America, and I wanted to see how refugee policy had changed once the Cold War ended. Because during the Cold War, the overwhelming majority of the people that we admitted into the United States as refugees came from communist countries. And so I wanted to understand what happens once the Cold War ended, who's coming in, who's being prioritized for admission. So that was the subject of that book. But in the writing of that book, and especially in interviewing some refugees and asylum seekers, and many of those interviews didn't make their way into that book, but they discussed environmental impacts and how they first migrated internally and then crossed borders, eventually found their way to the United States or to Canada. And so I thought, okay, this is something that really needs to be discussed, the environmental impacts of refugee migrations. And then, in preparation for this book, I immersed myself in the climate science to understand what's happening. And so I spent a couple of years just reading the climate science just to see, and there's some wonderful work that's being produced here at Cornell by our very own scientists. And so I just immersed myself in that work to try to understand, what was happening. And so I tried to merge the two topics together. But to come back to your question about post 9/11, I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Just really thinking about how post 9/11 policies, and particularly when you're talking about Montserrat, have shaped.
Right. Well, since 9/11, there's been an increased securitization of our borders. It's become increasingly difficult for people to migrate to the United States, to travel to the United States. It's just any kind of mobility. And so not surprisingly, there's been resistance to creating a track for admission for people who are environmentally displaced. But there needs to, because I think we're going to see much more climate displacement in the decades to come. Right, it's already occurring. But as I said, 80% of climate migrants today are internal. So they are out of sight, out of mind. But more and more people are starting to cross borders, international borders, as a result of climate displacement.
Okay, we'll come around with the mic.
I can just shout.
Okay.
Oh, okay, cool. First of all, thank you for coming to speak. I thought this was a really interesting talk. My question is, how would you address this criticism that we grant political asylum because people would be, wouldn't be like persecuted here if in the same way that they would in their home countries, but they would be affected by climate change here, and this maybe in a similar way that they would in their home countries. So they're not receiving safety here from climate disasters. So it wouldn't be considered in the same way that political asylum would.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of things that need to be worked. For example, one of the reasons why I keep stressing permanent displacement is that there seems to be a growing consensus that that people who are temporarily displaced may not be the population that you want to prioritize for asylum, right? And in fact, I mentioned earlier in my talk that that the U.S. at different moments has had has drafted policies ad hoc to respond to environmental disasters. And so, for example, during the 1950s and 1960s, there were attempts to accommodate different populations that had been displaced by environmental disasters. But the argument that always emerged within Congress was, reluctance to grant that. Those members of Congress who were reluctant to provide a pathway into the United States said, well, these folks are just temporarily displaced. We can help them rebuild so that they can stay in their country. So why are we granting permanent resettlement when the problem is only a temporary one? Shouldn't we be investing this money instead in helping people adapt? And that's a legitimate argument. And that's one of the, and if this bill, the Markey and Velasquez bill, ever passes, that's one of the issues that will need to be decided. Who should be accommodated in those 50,000 visas? Do you target people from the small island states like the Maldives that are quickly sinking and whose territories are disappearing? Do you target them? Or do you target people who have experienced permanent, temporary displacement? Trying to decide who to prioritize for those visas will be a difficult one, right? But thank you for the question. Thanks. Okay. There's a question. Okay.
Yeah, thank you for this talk. I'm curious about the nature of occupations between different countries. So, for example, if a country has a lot of agriculture and that's a huge part, and because of climate change, they're not able to live there, they're displaced, moving to another country, say to the US, and they find jobs as waitresses or something, but they're not doing agriculture anymore. Is that still considered a climate migration because there's a different proportion of occupations within each region?
That has to be played out. I mean, right now we don't have a short or long-term response to climate-driven migration. So right now, to accommodate anybody here in the United States, TPS is really the principal track to accommodate people who can't return home because of an environmental disaster. But it's only a temporary status. And hopefully, the talk showed how it's not an adequate response. On the one hand, you have this population who really shouldn't have returned home, but they were forced to return home. And then this other population that has been here for a quarter century, and they've been allowed to stay because it is deemed as important to our foreign policy and to the stability of the region. So in trying to come up with a policy to try to accommodate people who are permanently displaced, those are some of the issues that we're going to have to consider, that policymakers are going to have to consider, right? Now, to come back to the point that you said about those who are displaced from the land, what makes the Central American case study particularly interesting, too, is that they're not just being displaced because of the environmental disasters, although that's a really big piece of it. It's also the economic development policies in certain regions of Central America. The two work hand in hand. And so that's why it becomes really difficult to tease out the motivations that migrants have for migrating. Migration is always multi-causal. It's really hard to say this person is a political refugee, this person is an economic migrant, because migration is always multi-causal. People don't fall neatly into these distinct categories. They just don't. Thanks. Belle.
I know many countries in the global north have better climate policies and also refugee policies. They're more welcoming. How does the United States compare, in specifically climate refugee policy, to other countries in the global north? And have they taken any, not inspiration, but sort of tips from these other countries? Or have these other countries not really, in the global north specifically, have not really implemented any climate refugee policies as well?
That's a great question. Right now, I think all nations are engaged in these debates. New Zealand is the only nation that I know of at this moment that has this quota of 100 for climate refugees. I don't know of any other country. Although there is some discussion, there are a lot of countries that are engaged in these conversations about how will we accommodate, climate-driven migration. But creating a separate track, a distinct track for admission, I don't see it yet. I just haven't seen it yet. Thanks.
And then we can only take one more question after this question.
So the climate refugee surge will, in fact, act as a force multiplier for the general refugee crisis. Okay, it'll be a lot more people. And I wonder if you could look at that from the point of view of someone interested in human rights and democracy. We find, there's, on the one hand, it looks a lot easier for an authoritarian government to deal with that. And that's what the American right has seen in Hungary, after all, and so forth. Hungary rather than France or New Zealand or something like that. So I'm wondering if that threat to human rights that comes from this surge can be used as a way of mobilizing people on the left who were sort of purple on this in the past, after all. You not only mentioned Trump, you mentioned Biden, and we can also talk about Obama and those administrations. So nobody has that sort of perfect record on this. Nobody's addressed the questions you posed so well at the end of the lecture.
To be honest, in the current political climate, I see it. It seems very, very hard to mobilize anybody on the left or the right to open the doors, to pry open the doors, to create a separate complementary track for climate-driven migration. I just don't see it. And as I pointed out, one of the there are many humanitarian activists who are saying that what we need to do is redefine who or what a refugee is. But there's a lot of resistance to that redefinition of refugee status because many feel that it will lead to a dilution of protections for those who are politically persecuted, right? So, the complementary track might be the only way that we accommodate a climate-driven migration, but in today's political climate, it's really hard to imagine that Congress will create one. Yeah, so, thank you. Okay.
Hi, thank you so much, Professor. I guess I have two questions. The one kind of related to U.S. migration policy. So we learned in another class regarding migration that there were a period where the concept of temporary worker status or guest worker system are kind of like rejuvenated and be seen as a more kind of sustainable, economic, beneficial way for receiving those temporary kind of laborers into the market, but without supporting them with welfare system. Do you think that guest work system might expand in U.S. as a kind of a way to deal with future climate migrations?
Yeah, it could be, absolutely. I think these temporary guest worker programs might be a way to accommodate farmers who have been displaced by the land. But again, these programs they're temporary, right? So, yeah. You had a second question. Thank you.
Yes, my second question is related to your proposal to a comprehensive framework. A lot of things you touch upon, including humanitarian assistance, international community should adapt to a norm and reassess development policies in impoverished. My question would be kind of like, I know the topic of this book and this kind of lecture is regarding U.S. migration policy, but it's really hard for me to imagine as kind of an international community that only rely on certain countries' lead to, develop those humanitarian assistance, which is reliable and accountable, and also kind of a capability building for those countries who are kind of vulnerable to climate. So I wonder, like, under a more global perspective or international institutions, what are current trend? Is it optimistic to see more of collaboration and a more kind of standard coordinated effort, or just what that status of that could be?
I don't think, I think the international community is going to have to work together and manage resettlement. I don't think they're going to have a choice about it, to be honest. I think, right now, a lot of, many countries feel that they can turn a blind eye to accelerating climate change and the displacement that it's causing. But at some point, they're not going to be able to. And I think the international community is going to have to work together. This is not a burden that one nation can take on by itself. Nations are going to have to work collectively to engage in managed resettlement to help populations. And it might, in our hemisphere, it's going to start most likely with the Caribbean and Central America. That's where we're going to see the managed resettlement programs.
Thank you.
Sure.
Okay, well,
All right. Thank you so much for turning out. Thank you.